The aims and objectives for the next half an hour are to have a look at understanding anxiety and why we experience anxiety, to be able to recognise our own anxiety, think about the impact of the pandemic on our anxiety, which is particularly prevalent today with the rules changing from today, and to learn a few tools and techniques for managing the physical symptoms of anxiety. So before we do that, we're going to start with having a look at what anxiety is, because in order for us to recognise it within ourselves and start to put into place tools and techniques to help with how we feel, we need to know what we're on the lookout for. So a definition of anxiety by the American Psychological Association is an emotion characterised by feelings of tension, worried thoughts and physical changes like increased blood pressure. So people with anxiety disorders usually have reoccurring intrusive thoughts or concerns. They may avoid certain situations out of worry. They may also have physical symptoms such as sweating, trembling, dizziness, or a rapid heartbeat. So anxiety is a huge umbrella term that covers lots of different types of anxiety. So some of the different types of anxiety that we can experience is generalized anxiety disorder, sometimes called GAD or GAD, obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, health anxiety, specific phobias, panic. The list goes on. But you don't have to have an anxiety disorder to experience anxiety. Anxiety is on a spectrum and we all experience elements of anxiety. However, where we are on that spectrum defines how well we can cope with the symptoms at that given point in time. So we're all human and it's all completely normal for us to experience anxiety. However, it may develop into a disorder where further treatment or support is needed if it becomes uncontrollable and begins to have a substantial impact on our day-to-day. Each different anxiety disorder there on the screen has different characteristics, but throughout this session we'll be predominantly focusing on the physical symptoms of anxiety that form a part of all the anxiety disorders we've just mentioned, but more in a general sense than particularly in reference to any of the above. So let's start with having a think about how we feel when we feel anxious. So a question over to you. How do you feel, or how do we start to notice that we're starting to become anxious or feeling overwhelmed? As I mentioned, there is a slight delay between what I say and what you hear, so we'll just pause to allow your thoughts, if you want to share them, to come back through the question and answer box. So we're just having a think about how we feel when we feel anxious. What changes do we notice in ourselves? So just had a couple start to come through now. Thank you so much for those. So racing thoughts, absolutely. Being unable to sit still. Yeah, definitely. That kind of fidgety, restless feeling that we can't quite settle. Loss of confidence. Yeah, absolutely. Feeling hot, dizzy, lightheaded. Yeah. Had a really good thought come in there. Thank you, about not always being conscious of feeling anxious. And that might be one of the symptoms, absolutely. We're sometimes not kind of subconscious, if you like, running along in the background. And some symptoms we experience of anxiety, we might not associate to anxiety. Really good point there. Thank you for that. The dry mouth, yeah, especially in this heat, absolutely. All really great ideas there. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. I agree with each and every one of them. The anxiety, the symptoms we experience when we're feeling anxious are so overwhelming. Let's have a look then at some of the common symptoms we might experience. Some of them you've already mentioned. So we might experience vision changes. So perhaps our vision becoming a bit blurry, Feeling faint or dizzy, so a bit wobbly and a bit lightheaded. Needing the toilet or feeling sick, probably a really unpleasant, probably one of the most unpleasant symptoms, sorry. Palpitations or chest pain, really scary symptom of anxiety. Sweating, muscles aches and pains, shaky and jelly legs, and pins and needles. So we usually find that we experience our pins and needles in our extremities, so our fingers, our nose, our mouth, and our toes. Just had another one come in of loss of appetite. Yeah, absolutely, linked to those stomach changes. So all of these symptoms are really distressing and unpleasant, and everyone's experience of anxiety is completely different. So how I feel when I feel anxious is going to be completely different to how you feel when you feel anxious. So these are just some of the common symptoms. So why do we experience all these really unpleasant symptoms? It can be really helpful to understand where these symptoms are coming from. So it all comes back down to our fight or flight response. If any of you have already joined me on the Understanding and Controlling Panic session, you'll be familiar with this already. But I'll just recap it and run through it for anyone who's joining us for the first time today. So we all have this inbuilt fight or flight response, which is our body's natural alarm system to danger. It's our instinct. It's an automatic response that happens without our control. And it dates back thousands of years ago, back to when we were cavemen. So if I was around a campfire with my family and a predator was to walk into camp, such as a bear or lion or a tiger, I would need to respond appropriately in order to survive. So I would either need to choose to fight that predator or run away from that predator. So this automatic alarm system, our fight or flight response, served us also wonderfully well as we managed to evolve and survive up to modern day. Luckily, in modern day, we don't bump into predators walking down the street, a bear, a lion or a tiger. I definitely wouldn't be here if that was the case. And hopefully, we very rarely need to physically fight or run away. However, as this mechanism has been a survival instinct, we're animals and we're not going to change something that protects us so well. So each and every one of these physical symptoms that we've just looked at is there with a purpose in keeping us safe. Now, it doesn't feel like it, but each and every one has a role to play in our fight or flight response. So our vision changes. If I was being chased by a lion, I would need to find an escape route. So in modern day, we still look for that escape route, which can lead to blurry vision. And perhaps tension headaches. Feeling faint or dizzy? If I'm being chased by a lion, my only priority is my main muscle groups in my arms and my legs. So my blood rushes from my head to those main muscle groups, which can leave me feeling a bit wobbly and a bit lightheaded. Now, it's virtually impossible to faint from your fight or flight response if you've never fainted before, because our fight or flight response gives us a high blood pressure, and in order to faint, we need a low blood pressure. So that can be quite reassuring to know. However, fainters will faint, you will already know that. But if you have that feeling but you have never fainted before, it's virtually impossible. Needing the loo or feeling sick, really unpleasant symptom. If I'm being chased by a lion, what is the point in me digesting the porridge I've just had for breakfast? That's just going to slow me down and get in the way. So our digestion shuts off, and anything that's in our stomachs, in our tummies, is going to slow us down and get in the way. So we want to get rid of it, whether that's by going to the toilet or physically feeling or being sick. That's why that really unpleasant, not in our stomach feeling is there. Palpitations or chest pain, like I said a second ago, a really scary symptom. 1 in 6 who present at A&E with chest pain are experiencing anxiety. But please do always go and get yourself checked out. It's a very fine line and it's not worth the risk. So if you're experiencing chest pain, it's out of the ordinary, always go and seek medical attention. But this is because if it is linked to anxiety, it's because our heart is doubling in speed in order to get that extra blood around our body to provide our muscles with the energy it would need. Sweating, so feeling hot and sweaty, again a really unpleasant symptom, especially in this heat. There are 2 theories behind this one. The first is a little bit more scientific, and that comes back to temperature regulation. So if I'm being chased by a predator, I want to be at my optimum temperature in order to do so. The second theory is my favourite but less scientific, and this theory is that when we were cavemen, we obviously wore less clothing, we wore loincloths and more of our skin was exposed, and if a predator was to try to grab onto us, it would slip off. Like I say, less scientific, not exactly convincing in terms of the science, but it's a theory nonetheless. and muscle aches and pains. So again, if I've got the energy to fight or run away from a predator, that's holding a lot of energy within my muscles, which is understandable if it leads to aches and pains or restless feelings. Shaky and jelly legs, that feeling like our knees might buckle, is linked to our adrenaline response. Our adrenaline is releasing in order to give us that energy to fight or run away. And pins and needles in our extremities. My fingertips, my toes, my mouth and my nose, again, aren't important in that situation. Our blood rushes from them to our main muscle groups, but it can actually be quite painful if you do experience that. So that's the reason why we experience each and every one of those symptoms. So our body's not out to get us, our body is doing its absolute very best to try to keep us safe. But you're probably asking yourself, well, why do I have these symptoms if in certain situations we don't need to physically fight or run away? So our body doesn't know any other mechanism rather than our fight or flight response. In modern day, we're mainly faced with perceived threats, situations that make us feel anxious and vulnerable where there isn't any real threat to us. So this might be delivering a presentation, a busy supermarket, attending an interview, the thought of socialising post-lockdown, whatever it is, there's no right or wrong for what triggers our fight or flight response. But because our body only has one alarm system, our fight or flight response will start to kick in, whether we're in a physical threatened situation where we may need to fight or run away, or whether it's a hypothetical perceived threat. So it's a little bit like a smoke alarm in my house. My smoke alarm goes off more times than I care to admit when I burn my toast, but my house isn't on fire. It only has that one setting, which is trying to alert us to a danger, even if that danger isn't really there. And what we can do in modern day is we can build associations to certain situations where we feel our fight or flight response is needed. And that then reinforces our need for these really unpleasant physical symptoms that we experience. So if you experience those physical symptoms that we've just gone through, as distressing and as unpleasant as they are, your body is doing its absolute very best to try to look after you. So if you've attended any of these sessions before, you'll be familiar with the vicious cycle. So these sessions are based upon the principles of cognitive behaviour therapy, which looks at how our thoughts, our physical symptoms and our behaviours all link in together. And we get stuck in these vicious cycles. And the way CBT works is if we learn tools and techniques to change one of these areas, we'll be able to break out of this vicious cycle and things will start to feel a lot better. So let's just use an example to put some meat on the bones. So let's use an example of Daisy. So Daisy's been asked to deliver a presentation at work with short notice, and she's always found delivering presentations anxiety provoking. In that situation, understandably, we'd all probably feel the same. Daisy's thoughts are going to jump to the presentation. She might have thoughts such as, I can't do it, I'm not good enough, I might have no idea what I'm talking about, my manager might get bad feedback. This, understandably, is then going to trigger Daisy's fight or flight response because she's feeling vulnerable, anxious. Her body thinks, hang on, we're uncertain here, we need our fight or flight response to keep us safe. So she starts to experience these physical symptoms, perhaps feeling faint, heart racing, feeling quite shaky. These thoughts and these physical symptoms are going to influence Daisy's behaviours. She may start to over-prepare, she may start to rehearse in order to try to ease that anxiety that she's experiencing. The thoughts then continue. If her fight or flight response continues because of these thoughts and these behaviours, her thoughts may then turn to the physical symptoms that she's experiencing. So I'll pass out, everyone will see that I'm anxious. These thoughts aren't going to help Daisy's fight or flight response. They're going to reinforce the fight or flight response even further because Daisy's feeling even more vulnerable. So her fight or flight response kicks in and so forth. And we get stuck in these vicious cycles of the way that we think influencing our behaviours influencing our physical symptoms and so forth. So whenever you're not feeling yourself, whether you're feeling anxious, down or low, it's really helpful to start to understand these vicious cycles for ourselves because we all get stuck in them. So a really helpful tip can be to draw this triangle out. Write it down on a piece of paper. How am I physically feeling within my body? What thoughts are running through my mind? And what behaviours am I doing or have I done differently recently? because the sooner we start to recognise this vicious cycle, the sooner we can start to put into place tools and techniques to help with how we feel. So you're probably thinking, well, if in modern day, hopefully I'm not physically fighting or running away from anything, why have I still got my fight or flight response? Would we be better off without it? But we need it, because we may be in the unfortunate situation where we do need to fight or run away, or even down to the everyday, if we're walking down the street and a car was to come speeding down the road, we'd need our fight or flight to jump us out the way. So we can't get rid of anxiety because we need our fight or flight response. However, what we can learn to do is control our anxiety and reduce the associations that we build in these perceived hypothetical situations. We can manage our anxiety better so that we become lower down on that anxiety spectrum. Our fight or flight response is activated in any situation that makes us feel vulnerable or uncertain. So it's completely understandable that over the last 18 months, should we have noticed these changes and feeling more anxious than usual because it's an uncertain time. So thinking about from today, so of course the lockdown is easing, the guidance and the restrictions are changing today. In terms of these changes, what might we be feeling anxious about post-lockdown? Again, just a space for you to have a think, and feel free to pop your thoughts in the question and answer box back over to me. I will pause just to allow the system to catch up a little bit, but what might be feeling anxious about with the rules lifting today? So I've had a couple come in, thank you for those. So not wearing masks, yeah, absolutely. The change in social distancing, yeah. Returning back to work, absolutely. Yeah, changes in our vulnerability as the world is opening up, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, being at increased risk or being worried that we look over concerned compared to others. Being susceptible to COVID, yeah, absolutely. Increased risk and exposure to COVID-19, yeah, absolutely. In the worst case scenario thoughts. All completely understandable thoughts and concerns with the changes that are being put into place today. Thank you so much again for sharing your ideas there. Some of the things that we might be feeling anxious about is returning to an office environment, socialising, so being around family and friends, our health, our family's health, some of those that were mentioned in the chat, absolutely. Seeing family, places adhering to guidance, travel, whether that's for work or pleasure, whether that's here in the UK or overseas, children going to school and attending clubs, or on the flip side of that, now it's school holidays for a lot of people, managing that with the world and the guidance starting to open up, especially if we're returning back to work and we've now suddenly got our kids off at home for 6 weeks. So just want to zone in a little bit further on returning to an office environment, because this is the one that usually pops up as we adjusted so quickly to working from home, and now we've got this readjustment of perhaps returning to an office environment and what that might look like. So we might be worried about our time. We may have become adjusted to the lack of commute and spending more time with our family. And this may be something that's making us feel quite sad or unhappy about returning to this new normality. And should any concerns or worries about the change in restrictions make you feel sad about the restrictions lifting, then that's okay. It's all right to be feeling that way. We may be worried about finances. We may have become accustomed to not having the spend of commuting. I know I've definitely saved a fortune on petrol over the last 18 months, and we do quickly become accustomed to changes in our finances. We may be worried about meeting people in person. I've never met the team that I work alongside in person, so that may be anxiety-provoking thought. We've got used to building relationships through a screen, and it's different, and it's a change to go back to doing that in an in-person environment. Safety of an office, whether the office or even the people in the office are going to abide or adhere to any kind of guidance or rules that are put into place. And commuting, whether that is the worry of the traffic or whether that's getting on public transport or trains, all of these are completely understandable to be making us feel anxious. So it is completely normal for all of this new anxiety, all this new uncertainty to be triggering our stress response, so our fight or flight response. So it's more important now than ever that we're looking after ourselves along the way. We're not alone in this anxiety and this uncertainty of the next couple of months. So it's important that we're recognising that and we're putting into place techniques to help with how we feel. So let's have a think then about the physical symptoms. We've spoke a lot about the physical symptoms of anxiety today. Again, if you've joined me on the panic session, we did recap and go cover these in that session because it's the same fight or flight response. So the first thing that we can do to help ourselves is carry out progressive muscle relaxation. So relaxation is so important because if we've got the energy to fight or run away from a bear, we're not going to want to find a bench and curl up and go to sleep because that's against our nature, that's against our instinct. If we close our eyes and there's a predator around, we're vulnerable. So we're not going to be able to relax, wind down or go to sleep. So it's so important that we have this period to allow us to wind down. So progressive muscle relaxation is a really powerful technique that teaches us the difference of when our muscles feel tense alongside our fight or flight response and relaxed when our fight or flight response is relaxed. So even in the everyday, if we're perhaps busy and stressed at work, we may notice that our shoulders are tense up around our ears. Or for myself personally, I know when I'm feeling anxious because I get quite painful, achy legs because my legs and my feet can't sit still. So again, you'll know yourself, but relaxation is so important and I recommend to do it every day. The website that I recommend is at the end of these slides, but it's called stresscontrol.org. So that's stresscontrol.org. And on that website, there is a free zone and there's some free progressive muscle relaxation tracks. There's a long version and a quicker version. I'd always recommend starting with the longer version if we've got the time and then progressing down to the quicker version. You can do it any time of day. You can do it in the morning, on your lunch break, in an evening, wherever works for you. But if you are struggling to get to sleep and it's not linked just to the heat at the moment, then try doing it before you go to bed. It's a technique that I use myself if I can't get off to sleep. Exercise is the next important thing that is so valuable to our mental health. I know you're probably sick of hearing from left, right and centre that we need to exercise more, but it is not just for our physical health. If we think about the energy that we have stored up to fight or run away from a bear with our fight or flight response, we need an outlet for this. I embarrassingly walked to my greenhouse and back within a working day. That isn't the equivalent of fighting a bear if our stress response is activated. So we need a way to burn off this extra energy. The guidance is that in order to exercise enough to burn off the effects of our fight or flight response is that we exercise at a moderate amount. And what that means is that we can feel our heart rate is increased, but we're still able to hold and maintain a conversation. Now that's different for each and every one of us of what would take us to get to that point, but it's that extra heart rate rather than being completely out of breath. So you don't have to suddenly run a marathon or sign up for a gym membership. It's just that moderate amount of exercise. And what's recommended is more days than not over a week. So 3 or 4 days a week and for half an hour at a time in that day, but you can break that half an hour down over the course of the day. And usually when I mention exercise, time is a problem. Time is a barrier that's stopping us from carrying out that exercise. But we can be creative with that. If you are driving to work, can you park a bit further away, or can we get off the tube or the bus a bit further away? If we're working from home, can we run up and down the stairs a couple of times a day to increase our heart rate, or jog to the end of our garden and back, or play with our kids or our dogs, or whatever that might be, just to make sure that we're being more active to be burning off that fight or flight response. Breathing is so important. We all hyperventilate when our fight or flight response is activated, even at a minor level. So in the session on understanding and controlling panic, we have a look in detail behind the science of our hyperventilation. Even if you don't experience panic attacks per se, you will be hyperventilating. So please do join us on that session if that would be helpful. But the main message in a brief summary is that we need to slow down our breathing rate, because if we overbreathe, we hyperventilate, we're building up all the extra oxygen that we take in order to use for energy to fight or run away from a bear. So we start to get that store up, which isn't helpful for how we physically feel. So we want to slow our breathing rate right down. Do some breathing exercises, whether it's counting breathing exercises. I like to use a technique which we cover in detail on that session of square breathing. So it's simply following a square around, starting in the left-hand corner, breathing in along the one side of the square, pausing across the top, breathing out along the right-hand side of the square and pausing across the bottom. And that just slows that breathing rate right down. And we should do breathing exercises regularly, even if we're not feeling anxious and stressed, because our hyperventilation can be running along in the background. And lastly is mindfulness. So mindfulness is a nice recommended treatment for both anxiety and depression. When we're feeling anxious and stressed, our fight or flight response is activated. That's the amygdala, part of our brain that drives that response. What we want to do is re-engage our prefrontal cortex, which is our rational thinking part of our brain, and mindfulness has been proven to help with that. So mindfulness doesn't have to cost the world in terms of time. People have a lot of preconceptions about mindfulness, that we have to be mindful or meditate for hours on end a day. Nothing like that. Mindfulness can be done in the moment. A technique that I like to use in the moment is the 5 senses. So tuning into what you can see, hear, smell, touch and taste. And that just grounds us, makes us aware on the here and now, and then will help us to refocus on whatever the activity is that we're doing in front of us. Through Benedin, you have access to exercise classes and mindfulness classes through ourselves, so they complement these sessions beautifully. So please do join us on those. And if anyone is skeptical about mindfulness, I challenge you to give it a try, and you might really notice a shift in terms of how you're feeling. Some additional resources to complement that. If you literally Google NHS self-help guides, the first website that comes up is the one that you can see on the screen, and that's the Northumberland Tyne and Wear NHS service. On there is about 20 to 30 booklets. The anxiety and panic booklets are brilliant and talk you through exactly what we've gone through today. There's that progressive muscle relaxation website I mentioned, so stresscontrol.org. You've got Headspace and Calm, which are fantastic mindfulness apps. Headspace have actually recently released a series on Netflix, which I've done myself. It's a fantastic series. So if you already pay for Netflix, then have a look at those on there. But there's also so many free resources about on YouTube, and like I say, our mindfulness classes that we run too. And Mind is a fantastic organisation. There's so much information about our mental health on their website, so please do have a look on their website as well. So in terms of today's session, as I mentioned, it's one of 3. So if I haven't seen you on the other sessions and they would be helpful, please do join us. The worry one might be particularly helpful at the moment with all the future focused anxiety and uncertainty that's going on. So I hope to see you on those sessions if you think you'll find those helpful. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time today, especially bright and early on this hot and stuffy Monday morning. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've managed to take something away from today's session and you found it helpful. You should have received a booklet that has the information that we've spoken through attached to it. If you haven't received that booklet, then please do let me know in the question and answer box and I can copy the email over to you. But if you pop us an email on our Benetton Health email, the same one you got the invite to the session for, we can pop that over to you. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. And remember, you've got access to your 24-hour mental health helpline and your physiotherapy helpline as well, should you need any further support. I've also copied a feedback link within the chat, always looking to improve the work we do and really value any feedback. So if you do have a spare couple of minutes, I would really appreciate